Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Victor Wallis is a professor of liberal arts at the Berklee College of Music, where he teaches contemporary history and modern political thought. For 20 years, he was the managing editor of Socialism and Democracy, and about a year ago, he joined me to talk about his broad alternative framework of America, which he laid out in his work, Democracy Denied. In this week's Who, What, Why podcast, we're going to talk about what he sees as the level of popular discontent in the U.S. and elsewhere, how it has shown a dramatic increase in recent years, how COVID-19 has contributed to it, and how he'd like to see it crystallize into a cohesive anti-capitalist political force. At a time when socialism has become a word one doesn't use in polite company, Wallace aims to contribute to a popular movement for socialism. In his newest book, Socialist Practices, History and Theories, he seeks a new discussion of issues surrounding socialism. It is my pleasure to welcome Victor Wallis here to the Who, What, Why podcast. Victor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to join you.
What is the biggest misconception you think people have when they hear the word socialism today?
Well, probably it's the idea that it's the all-powerful government. That's the image they have, that dates back to Cold War days. It's all-powerful government. And I think that the main thing that this leaves out of account is that the real essence of socialism is to eliminate the division of society into a class of highly concentrated wealth owners and everyone else. I mean, you eliminate that class division. That's the essence of the socialist striving. So the misunderstanding on the part of those who hate that idea is based on just identifying it exclusively with the vision of an all-powerful government, all interfering, and so on. But there's also a misconception on the part of people who are not so hostile, who interpret socialism as meaning just having some liberal reforms and social services and that sort of thing. This is the sort of the Bernie Sanders model, the New Deal model. That's not socialism either. Obviously, it's a much better thing than what we have now. However, the problem with it, as we know from the experience of since the New Deal, is that if you merely introduce these progressive measures, Social Security, health care for all, and so on, if you merely introduce them without altering the class composition of the society, the capitalist class will simply, bit by bit, undo them, will take them back, like in Britain, where they sort of render the National Health Service less capable of doing its work by defunding it, and in this country where there have been all the attacks on welfare, and there's a continuing, even now, and even with Biden, the prospect of trying to undermine Social Security, and all the other sort of counter reforms, and notably also during the Clinton period, the undoing of the regulations against speculative activity. All those things get undone. So socialism has to be, on the one hand, more than what Bernie Sanders calls democratic socialism, which is just the New Deal. But on the other hand, it isn't the vision of an all-powerful government. The idea of socialism is basically that you do away with the class division of capitalist society, and you have a society in which there are no class differences between people. That doesn't mean that everybody's exactly identical, obviously not. But there's no class of large property owners set over against everybody else. So then you can really have a democratic process because people are on an equal footing with one another.
Isn't there something, though, in human nature that is antithetical to that idea?
Well, human nature has a history that goes back thousands of years, and so it's taken different forms. And the particular form of, quote, human nature, unquote, that we see under capitalism is one that has evolved in connection with capitalism. That is to say, the idea that humans are naturally competitive, aggressive, and needing to dominate, and so on. So human societies existed for many thousands of years. You still see some trace of this in indigenous societies today, where people are not into that kind of psychology. And even where in the earlier primitive societies, you didn't have ideas of male supremacy and so on. So human nature is malleable. It's flexible. It can change. And I think we can see this change even in ourselves, each of us, how we act in different situations, that in certain situations we act in a cooperative way, and in others we act in a competitive way. And the idea would be to create structures that enable us to act in the cooperative way, and our acting, it's a dialectic. You create the structures in which we can cooperate, then the cooperative kind of practice ensues, and it maintains the new kind of approach. But I mean, if we're forced into a kind of scramble of all against all, especially as there's increasing conditions of scarcity, that brings out the most negative, sort of aggressive, competitive dimensions of human nature.
Those aspects of human nature evolved, though, over literally, as you alluded to, over thousands of years. To think that they can devolve in a shorter period of time, isn't that unrealistic?
Well, the capitalist approach, that was introduced rather suddenly and dramatically in a quick period of time. I mean, it was a terrific jolt that the let's say the more cooperative approach for the majority of humanity was still in existence at the time capitalism was introduced, and it produced a great jolt. I mean, I remember reading accounts about how people initially reacted against the whole idea of assembly line factory work and the whole idea that of needing to get paid more in order to buy more stuff, as opposed to getting enough to get by and sort of live comfortably and be satisfied with that. There was nothing natural about the imposition of it. So it wasn't a natural evolution. It was a sudden imposition. I mean, sudden, it came at different times in different countries and in different regions of countries over a period of 100 or 200 years, which is not a huge span of time in the course of human history. But I mean, the capitalist the generalization of the capitalist mentality was something that was imposed rather speedily in historical terms.
Do you think that there is something inherent in the democratic system we have, in the republic, in the Madisonian republic that we have, that is supportive of the capitalist idea?
Yes. I mean, well, let's say the capitalist idea was a kind of underlying assumption when the system was set up, and it maintains it in place. And the way it maintains it in place, the conscious aspect of it was the fear on the part of the founding fathers of giving too much power to popular bodies, whether the population as a whole or a directly representative body. Everything, all their calculations were how to keep that in check. So that's definitely, let's say, that's in support of a class society, and of course the specific form of the class society was and remains capitalist. So the system we have is designed in so many ways to block that and to block the expression of popular will. And I mean, the most obvious element in the Constitution that we're now frothing with now is the Electoral College itself. The whole idea that the people would not directly choose the president, but it would be through the Electoral College. All that. So not to say that merely having everybody have the vote directly would be enough. There are many other things that intervene in between the popular interests and will and the actual outcomes of government. But that's the most obvious one, just the intervention of the Electoral College in between the people's vote and the selection of the person who's going to be in charge. But I mean, the political parties themselves, the corporations injecting huge amounts of money, controlling the parties basically through their financial influence, that's another element that we all know very well, which interferes with it. So, but I mean, in terms of just the Constitution, the Electoral College is the most obvious thing, but I think you can say also the kind of complex mix of central or national on the one hand and state governments on the other hand, the play back and forth between them, how that the kind of confusion of the whole process gets in the way of implementing any kind of alternative popular agenda that might be arrived at. Even the idea of the Senate, with the idea that only 1/3 of it is renewed every 2 years, that was certainly designed to prevent any kind of succumbing to popular impulses. So there's all kinds of things in the beginning. It was stated quite explicitly in the Federalist paper number 10, where Madison expressed the fear of the popular majority feeling a sense of its common purpose and being capable of acting in unison. And now we have all kinds of divisions. So in addition to the constitutional divisions, of course, there's the racial division, but that in turn has been reinforced and maintained in effect by all kinds of legal mechanisms, both constitutional and in terms of legislation.
So why should we assume today that a system based on popular will, a system that is counter to what the founders set up, would be arguably better?
Well, it's hard to imagine a more catastrophic situation than we're in and we face now. I mean, it's a real emergency situation in which the indefinite economic expansion is leading us headlong into a crisis of existence for the whole species. So better than that is one that where the decisions are made not in terms of perpetual growth and accumulation and profit maximization, but in terms of the real interests of the population. And so that's almost by definition it would be better. And I guess the question that naturally arises is what about the actual disposition of the population now? And of course that's a huge problem, because if you merely, and this is why I said it's not enough just to eliminate the Electoral College, because if you still have the level of information, the level of understanding, the level of socialization that you have now, you'll get similar results to what you have now. It won't be any better. So we're obviously talking about a huge process of consciousness raising, education, coming to an awareness of these things. But there's a tremendous pressure to undertake this quickly because of the nature of the emergency, which we see expressed in so many ways. I mean, not only the obvious environmental disasters that are taking place, the enormous forest fires, increasing intensity, and hurricanes, and so on and so forth, but also the social discontent, the tens of millions of people, increasing numbers, especially now with the COVID, who are in poverty. And so the need to organize against all that is enormous. It can't be understated. So the people who are suffering from all this, if they could be brought together in their own terms and not under the sponsorship of one of the corporate dominant parties, they would necessarily produce something that corresponded more to what they need than otherwise. So there's in other words, a tremendous discrepancy between even what people are aware that they want and what they actually choose in the form of candidates. And I found this expressed very concretely this past spring when we had the Democrat primaries, and on the Super Tuesday when Biden won the Super Tuesday vote, but they had these surveys conducted of people leaving their voting, asking what they wanted in terms of health care. And the overwhelming majority wanted health care for all, which is exactly what Biden was opposing. So there's a structure in place that gets in the way of the actual expression of the popular interest and desire.
You talk about the need within the context of an emergency, or even in any context for that matter, of education and information. Do you think that certainly there's no evidence that that kind of education and information can be scaled up to 250 million people in a way that is effective when we look at simply how tremendous numbers of people have reacted to the pandemic, how people have reacted to guns and shootings? There is real question as to whether that kind of education and information can be scaled up.
I agree that it's a huge question. I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm just saying that it needs to be done. And what I would add to that, though, is that as more and more people become aware of this need, they will organize more and more. There is more of a sense of the urgency of the situation. There is more receptivity, specifically even to the idea of socialism, however it's understood among people. And this despite all the years of socialization. You know, among young people, a majority are more disposed towards socialism than towards capitalism. That's also the case in the African American population. So it's a question of organizing, and has to be done obviously it's a matter of great urgency. But this doesn't mean that it's easy. But the means are there, and I suppose there's a little bit more means of expression outside just the huge corporate-owned news media and so on. Although, of course, there's still a problem because the other platforms that people use for communicating indirectly, like Facebook and Google, they're still also corporate-owned, and they, as we know, can exercise censorship in various forms. So there's still a need to establish more ways of communicating among people that will be able to bypass any possible repressive activity on the part of such institutions. But I'm not saying it's easy, but it has to be done.
In many ways, the whole idea behind things like Facebook and Twitter and social media in general was to democratize information.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. But the thing is that at the limits, the corporations that set up these platforms can exercise a kind of veto power and have done so, and they've limited the reach of certain outfits. There was actually a congressional hearing, I think, in which they brought up the case of the World Socialist website that suddenly saw its hits dropping by about 90% or something like that because of the way the Google search operated on them. So, in principle, the mechanism is there. It's available, but it's controlled by interests that may at certain points and that do at certain points intervene when they feel that their status is threatened. The latest thing I was looking at is there's an old film from 1968 called The Year of the Pig, and it's on YouTube. But it comes with warnings about this may be undesirable. Do you want to go ahead? It came up twice, and of course that's the least bad. In other cases, they'll just drop it altogether. But so it's a constant that people need to find ways to communicate that are independent of that, and it will involve, of course, ultimately going back to direct face-to-face stuff. Well, even though that's a bit hard to imagine in the time of the pandemic.
Does socialism as a concept, as you've been talking about it and defining it, does it need a rebranding? Does the idea have to be reconceived and resold as opposed to selling it as socialism?
Yeah, well, I don't see any point in sort of changing the name because it still comes back to the same thing. Because if it's not capitalism, what is it? In other words, if the society is not run, if you don't have a dominant capitalist class in the society, that leaves the society as a whole, and that's what socialism is. I think it's not so much certainly kind of renaming or rebranding, but more a better understanding of what the idea itself is, and to disassociate it from instances of extreme repressive dictatorship, to explain those past instances by historical analysis, but also to present examples of a different form of operation. And I think we're constantly getting new instances. I think that one of the things about the examples of socialism is we should look not only at whole countries, but also at instances where particular institutions are run in a socialist manner, so that a productive enterprise that's run democratically by its workers that's in accordance with a socialist principle. So the point is that the idea has to be, as I said at the beginning, to get away from identifying socialism with the all-omniscient government, and point at rather the idea of eliminating the existence of a privileged class, which thereby opens the door to democracy. So it's definitely a democratic notion. The only reason I find a problem with Sanders' description of democratic socialism, that he understands democratic in a different way, in his concept, the way he actually defines it, he's talking about the New Deal model, which means socialism without eliminating the capitalist class. But for me, socialism is eliminating, or let's say dissolving is a better way to put it, because it's not a matter of the people disappearing. It's a matter of the structure that through which they govern disappearing. So you dissolve the capitalist class, and then you have social preconditions for democratic interaction among all the members of the population. And that's the part of the education that needs to take place. One person who's actually doing a lot of educational work in this direction is the economist Richard Wolff, who has a program called Democracy at Work, which you may know, and he emphasizes the whole cooperative aspect of it. And he has a very powerful critique of capitalism. But he brings out that the alternative is not to create the all-powerful state, but rather to have a society with institutions that are run on democratic principles. And that's the essence of socialism, but you can't have it as long as there's a concentrated privileged class.
And what becomes the object then of that society? How is innovation and progress incentivized?
Well, there's so much of a need for certain things I don't think that's a question. And in other words, you don't have to depend on financial rewards to innovate or to make progress or to be creative. There can be objective needs, whether it's a physical problem with the environment or the problem of dealing with an illness. And there are people who are committed to this type of thing and who do it out of their professional and even human and citizen commitment, and they don't depend on financial incentives. And I think we do have an example of this today, which I think is an extremely important one for this, which is the case of Cuba, which has an incredibly powerful, arguably the most powerful healthcare system in the world, the highest proportion of healthcare workers per capita in the country, and even an excess, so that they send them overseas. And despite the bad mouthing of them that's carried on systematically by the United States, the United States government is afraid of a positive example that runs on principles counter to their own. These are very dedicated people, and they reflect an ethic of service that has arisen as a result of the Cuban Revolution. And they're enormously motivated, and they're also very innovative in terms of research in the scientific fields, and with particular attention to health issues, immunizations, and cancer treatment, and so on.
Talk a little bit about the fact that the U.S., even if you could wave your magic wand and make all of this happen here in the United States, that there is still a whole world out there, many places of which are driven by this capitalist model.
Well, actually the U.S. is the one where the drive is the strongest. So if the U.S. changed, that would have an enormous impact on everything else. I mean, the U.S. is strong enough, is independent enough, it would have nothing to fear. I mean, but yeah, that's where the magic wand thing becomes a bit problematic. I think the way things actually go, the initiative seems to be taking place more outside the U.S., but it has to come back and be felt in the U.S. so that the initiatives elsewhere can flourish. I mean, so that the U.S. government spends its energies preventing that kind of initiative from developing, as it has, especially in Latin America in the last few decades. It's doing everything to prevent those kinds of changes from taking root. But I think if the United States had a kind of leadership that was inspired by these principles, it could encourage, instead of thwarting, the developments that are taking place in other countries, and could be in a more cooperative relationship with other powers, including in particular the Chinese. And I'm not saying the Chinese are not an entirely positive model, because they have tremendous inequalities in the society. But on the other hand, the government has shown a capacity to make quick changes of a type that a capitalist government isn't really in a position to do, in direction of changing the forms of energy that they'll put an emphasis on, and that type of thing. And so if there could be a cooperative relationship, if we got away, I think the biggest change it would make in terms of the rest of the world is that it would remove the justification for the military-industrial complex, that huge amounts of resources could be diverted away from military pursuits to the betterment, both within this society and in other parts of the world. So it would be it would facilitate changes in other parts of the world as well.
You talk about eliminating things like the Electoral College and talking more about a direct democracy, a direct participation. Suppose that were to happen and what the people wanted was more capitalism.
Well, you see, the thing is, as I said right away, it's not enough to eliminate the Electoral College. The understanding needs to be changed. But the thing is, people don't want more capitalism. That's the misconception. I mean, even if that's what they think they want, if you break it down into specific things that they actually need in terms of their livelihoods, what they want is a decent society. They want a society at peace. They want a society where they have assured education and health care and so on and so forth. So and what has to be understood is that those things provided to everybody is something that capitalism is not going to facilitate. In fact, now it has the whole additional development of these massive mega thousands of dollars of student debt for so many individuals. That capitalism, retaining capitalism, stands in the way of getting the concrete things that people want. So they wouldn't. The reason now that they seem to be voting for capitalism is that the only two available powerful parties are both capitalist parties, and they have this neat sort of symbiotic relationship with each other, where one of them attacks the other justifiably as being racist, misogynist, xenophobic, and so on, and the other falsely, the Republicans falsely attack the Democrats as being socialist, and so you end up having this kind of dance where everybody votes for one or the other, but in so doing, the majority are voting against their own interests. But so people will part of the educational process and the organizational process is for people to understand the connection between the things they need, like universal health care and education and peace and a dissolution of racist tendencies and end to war, the connection, why all those things put together cannot be achieved within a capitalist framework, that the capitalist framework does exactly the opposite. It perpetuates all those ills.
What has the pandemic taught you about all of this?
Well, it's a kind of extreme example. I mean, it's dramatized all the difficulties. I mean, the first difficulty being the absence of a universal health care system in this country. The idea that you have free at the point of service health care, and also, but many other things too, because in order to combat this crisis, in order to combat the illness, you not only need to have all the hospitals and the protective equipment and so on, but people have to have homes. You can't have homeless people, and there has to be no discrimination against people who are not citizens, because and there has to be no situation of millions of people in prison in situations where they can't distance themselves. All these things clash with a proper response to the pandemic. And then of course, you also have the underlying economic compulsion to disregard human health in favor of maintaining the continuation of the economy. And so there's been this catastrophic outcome in the United States as a result of that. And even prior to the actual onset of the pandemic, the capitalist approach to running hospitals of limiting their capacity and having quick turnover and partly also as a result of the pressures of the insurance industry, who doesn't want to pay out hospital costs and so on. And so you had actually a decline in the number of hospital beds prior to the pandemic, instead of having a surplus of beds so as to allow for any possible emergency. So every aspect of the capitalist practice has got in the way of a proper response to the pandemic.
And do you suspect that when the pandemic is behind us, that there will be any lasting impact in terms of people's views of the kinds of things you're talking about?
Well, it's possible. Again, that depends on how good the work is, how effective the work, educational work is that's done on the basis of it. Certainly, there'll be a lot of lessons to be drawn from it. And I I mean, I can't imagine these situations where people, I read in the Dakotas, they're going to their death from COVID, swearing that it's a hoax, and I mean that somehow something will have hit home as a result of it. But I don't know how soon the pandemic is going to end. But it's certainly a teaching moment, and I think the unemployment and so on that has resulted from it, the increased misery of all kinds, has created a tremendous situation of discontent, which is not yet, properly focused. I mean, it's not focused on so much on the system, but there's a discontent which does create the situation for a rapid coming to awareness on the part of many people. But how fast it'll happen and how it will happen, that's for us to determine. But I think that the more work that's done by especially alternative media that are outside of and independent of the corporate influence, is going to be of vital importance in this process.
Is there leadership that you see anywhere with respect to the things you're talking about? Political leadership?
Yeah. Well, I would say that what's missing is a single organization that could to which everyone who understands the urgency can gravitate, that would actually constitute a coherent political force. There's lots of leadership, I would say leaderships in the plural, many different organizations, and including political organizations, also interest organizations of various kinds, that are doing good work in connection with this whole issue. Whether it's Food and Water Watch or the Organic Consumers Organization or Greenpeace or environmental organizations, anti-racist organizations. There's any number of organizations, and in terms of political parties, it's more difficult. I think one thing that has to be understood is it's tremendously repressive. It's very difficult. I mean, for example, the Green Party now has been struggling for decades and is constantly fighting against the processes of repression against it in the form of state laws, disqualifying it from the ballot, lawsuits against it, trying to prevent it from, and even the Commission on Presidential Debates, which keeps it out. It's a commission that's run by the two dominant parties themselves. It's a tremendously repressive situation, so it's difficult. And I think that's one of the big challenges. And so, in a way, you'll have to have an enormous social movement before you can get a political party that can break through all that repressive apparatus. And who knows what kinds of changes will have to take place in order to bring it about. So, as it now stands, the kind of leadership that has some focus on some of the necessary steps is found among certain elected officials within the Democratic Party, but so some of the younger members of Congress and so on. But they are limited by the organizations that they're in also, so that they can provide some good ideas and help popularize some of the things that have to be done, but they don't constitute by themselves the kind of unifying force that will be needed, that'll have to arise.
Is it a unifying force, or is what's really needed charismatic leadership?
Yeah, well, I would prefer to put that in the plural. I'm very wary of relying, especially on single individuals, which is what's usually understood when you speak of charismatic leadership. Also, because in this country we have a terrible tradition that's part of all the rest of it, of charismatic leaders being assassinated, and this is a systemic problem. It's not the product of lone nuts, so to speak. It's systemic, that we can't depend on overwhelmingly important individual leaders. Obviously, there'll have to be leadership, but what there needs to be is there has to be a collective leadership. There have to be many individuals with leadership capacities, and who do, as a result of doing their work, develop charismatic qualities. But in terms of relying on sort of a symbolic or even real leadership vested in an individual, that's a very dangerous course.
Isn't that, though, sort of inherent in the culture that we live in today?
Well, yeah, I mean, the culture, the celebrity culture tends to promote that. It looks for leaders, but I think that's an aspect of the culture that also has to be called into question. I think one of the aspects of the culture that's most dangerous is this comparison among people, rating, rankings, the whole emphasis about being the top, being the best, that everybody can strive for excellence, and it's not a question of being better than someone else. And so the idea that someone who's conspicuous and so on is therefore what you should look up to, that's not the point. I think it's a question of developing actually what I would say is a more democratic culture, and a democratic culture is one that sees value in everyone.
Victor Wallis, his latest book is Socialist Practice, History and Theories. Victor, it is always a pleasure. I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.